Extend the Limit, What Now for Egg Freezing. This event is produced with the support of the British Fertility Society, Cooper Surgical, London Egg Bank, the Senior Infertility Nurse Group, and Tomorrow Life Sciences. And the hashtag is Extend the Limit. Egg freezing for social or non-medical reasons, whatever we like to call this reproductive option, is the topic under the spotlight for this evening's discussion. And following PET's Extend the Limit campaign and our petition, and some of you will have signed our Extend the Limit petition. If you hadn't already done so, we'll be posting the link to this in the chat so that you can sign it and share it. We'd like to get this up to 1,500 people this week, so any help you can give on that would be great. But as a result of this campaigning and the work that others have done too, the government is now effectively proposing to abolish the current distinction between medical and non-medical reasons for freezing, and thereby allowing all patients to renew consent every 10 years for up to 55 years overall. And this is for the storage of eggs, but it will also apply to sperm and to embryos. Now, many, including PET, have welcomed this announcement, but we weren't quite cracking the champagne bottle open because much will depend on the fine detail of how and when the relevant changes are implemented. So some of the things that we've been kicking around of, what we want to know in the office are, which laws will be changed and how, and when will the changes come into effect, particularly when. What will happen to frozen eggs that reach the current limit before the law is changed? Will government heed calls to introduce an immediate moratorium on the destruction of eggs that reach the limit? The government has said that there will be new requirements for statutory 10-year review periods, and explicit written consent from the patient will be required to continue storage. So we want to know, what will these new requirements be? And then the government has also warned that the changes will have consequential implications for some particular storage classifications, including third-party donations, known or family donations, posthumous use and research. And again, we'd like to know what these consequential implications will be. To what extent will the new arrangements be specified in legislation on the statute book? And to what extent will these arrangements be left to the fertility regulator, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, the HFEA? What will they have to define them? Anyway, I'm in the lucky position of just asking questions and not having to answer any of them this evening, because we have 6 key figures lined up for you, and they'll be speaking in this order. So we have Steve Pugh, Joanne Anton, Mark Wilcox, Jason Kasraie, Sharon Jones, and then Ruth Deech. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, Steve Pugh. Steve is team leader for assisted conception and embryology at the UK government's Department of Health and Social Care. Previously, he worked on the UK's mitochondrial donation regulations and was responsible for the first government guidance for people considering surrogacy in England and Wales. And before he got involved in this area, he helped to establish the UK National Screening Committee.
I'm going to attempt to sprint through the policy development process of how we came to review the provisions of the HFE Act around storage limits for gametes and embryos. Hopefully, you all already know that the key provisions in this area are Section 14 of the HFE Act 1990 and the 2009 HFE statutory storage period for gametes and embryo regulations. The face of the Act provides for a baseline limit of 10 years, while the regulations provide for variation in specific cases, with renewable limits up to 55 years for those with evidence of premature infertility. Now, I should set some ongoing context here that the HFE Act elicits a lot of different views, as you'll know, from the public, across the clinical community, and from politicians, and therefore from ministers too. So on the slide, I've stolen one of Sarah's tricks here, and along the bottom of the slide is a gallery of Secretary of States and junior policy ministers who've all had a policy interest in storage limits since the department was first lobbied on this particular issue in 2017 through other parliamentarians and stakeholders such as Sarah. Now, I won't name them all, and you probably won't be able to identify them all, but the newest lead policy minister arrived just last week. And that's Maria Caulfield, who's right at the end of the line there. And we hope to bring her up to speed on HFE issues before Parliament returns on the 18th of October. So there have been a range of different views within the department and particularly within ministers about whether to address storage limits separately from any broader review of the HFE Act. And our initial, or the collective initial view, was one of caution about opening up the HFE Act on a specific issue. Now, while the department has held a kind of watchful waiting stance for a number of years, the most significant step in the overall reform process, if you like, was in mid-2019, when the then Secretary of State and the new junior policy minister at the time asked for advice about the underlying issues in this area. And as a result of that ask, they then agreed that a public consultation should be undertaken based on a case for change, which included technology improvements, societal attitudes, and changing patterns and timing of family formation. I should add that this was actually a few months before Sarah launched PET's Extend the Limit campaign, but I won't take anything away from her ongoing efforts to chivvy and hurry us along. Now, you may remember 2019 being quite an eventful year in politics, and there was a lot of upheaval due to the Brexit parliamentary logjam and the subsequent general election. We therefore didn't actually get the consultation cleared and published until February 2020. Could I have the next slide, please, sir? And while we were sitting back and congratulating ourselves about that, COVID changed the game for the rest of the year in terms of moving departmental resources to support the response and deferring other non-COVID related priorities. So the consultation period finished in May, but there were no analytical resources to support a review of the responses until the end of that year because of COVID. However, we did manage to bring in the COVID storage regulations, which allowed an additional 2-year storage period for all to take account of the service shutdown and people deferring treatment decisions until after the worst of the pandemic. Now, having reviewed the 1,222 consultation responses, some were more detailed than others, and thanks to Sarah and Joanne, our next speaker, for the detail. We formed a picture of the key messaging which underpinned our approach. And that was that there was clear support to increase the statutory storage limits for gametes and embryos. There was no consensus about how long any extension should be. And there was support for storage limits for egg, sperm and embryos to be the same for all, irrespective of medical need. Could I have the next slide, please, Sarah? So the full results of the government response document are available, but here are a few examples of both the diversity of opinion and of consensus. So you can see from the first pie diagram that in respect of increasing limits, there's overwhelming clarity of people's views. In respect of equal treatment of male and female gametes and embryos, they show a clear preference in the bottom chart, and on the chart on the right, in respect of the actual time limit, they are extremely varied. Although interestingly, if you put together the results of donors' lifetime and unlimited storage, you actually get the kind of highest overall response. Could I have the next slide, please, Sarah? Thank you. Now, in assessing a new policy approach, we were looking through a frame of 4 key criteria. Those were ensuring equity for all patients, facilitating greater reproductive choice, reducing administrative burden to fertility clinics and the regulator, and ensuring public acceptability. And in terms of considering the different policy options, we focused our assessment of those criteria on a no change scenario, a 10-year renewal up to 20 years, 10-year renewals up to 55 years, and through the donor's lifetime. Now, our preferred option based on this approach was to equalize the scheme for those with medical reasons for storing material with those who wanted to store for their own reproductive choice reasons. And departmental ministers agreed to this policy in the spring of 2021. And so once the policy was agreed, our next step was to complete the government response document and secure clearance to publish it alongside the policy announcement. As was becoming a theme, this was not straightforward. Indeed, we changed the Secretary of State during that crucial period. And so for various reasons, we missed our intended slot to publish before this summer's parliamentary recess. However, we eventually published on Parliament's return on the 6th of September. And overall, I think we've been pleased with the overall reception to the policy change. Could I have the final slide, please, Sarah? So as Sarah mentioned, we are, in terms of next steps, we are undertaking a further technical consultation about the consequential impacts of the change to the overall scheme. And this is in respect to third-party donation, posthumous use, and consent to research. Provisions in these areas are intended to be included in any legislation, but they remain quite thorny. We haven't started that consultation yet, but will be imminently. We're also having ongoing discussions with HFEA legal colleagues to explore the extent to which any amending legislation might address some of the additional outstanding issues that the sector is facing in terms of some historical cases. And of course, the HFEA will also be considering how to oversee such a significant change to the legislation. And no doubt Joanne will be speaking to this very shortly. Now, Sarah's already mentioned it, and I know that a key question from many of you will be, when will the law change? Now, learning the lessons of COVID, I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. So I will have to say that the answer is that the government will legislate when parliamentary time allows. Even on Zoom, I think I can hear the groans, so you might not find that especially helpful. But I can say that discussions are ongoing about the most suitable vehicles for changing the legislation, but no decisions have yet been taken. We have made, or the government, the department have made a commitment that no one with material currently in storage should lose out. And there are other ways that we can make good on that commitment while we sort out the most appropriate timing and vehicle for the primary legislation.
Our next speaker this evening is Joanne Anton, and Joanne is Head of Policy at the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority.
So today I'm going to be talking to you about our response to the government's new gamete storage limit proposals, and hopefully provide you with some useful background on the changing landscape of treatment and the issues that still need some further thought, those thorny issues Steve referred to in his presentation. So, make sure I can. Okay, so for anyone who isn't familiar with the HFEA and what we do, we're the regulator of fertility treatment and human embryo research in the UK. We set standards, inspect and license fertility clinics, and we provide a range of information for the public, particularly people seeking treatments, donor conceived people and donors, primarily through our website. And I think what's important for you to know today, with regards to today's topic, is that we inspect against and provide guidance on those storage rules, providing advice to the sector. And I think that puts us in a unique position, really, to be able to comment on the proposed changes and the challenges that clinics face currently, and hopefully how to avoid any future challenges when the law changes. So in terms of the legislation itself, I won't go into this in too much detail. Steve briefly mentioned it, but as you may know, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act governs the use of treatment of use and treatment of gametes and embryos. The Act sets out the storage limit at a maximum of 10 years. It was updated in 2009 to extend that limit to a maximum of 55 years, but only for patients who are likely who are prematurely infertile in the written opinion of a medical practitioner. And I think this is a key point that Sarah mentioned around the detail of any future changes, because it's the 2009 regulations that we often see clinics struggle with in terms of complying. So just a note that any new rules really do need to kind of be clear for the sector and for patients. We had the recent coronavirus regulations that brought an extension of 2 years in certain circumstances. But really, kind of since there's been any big changes in the storage periods, there have been significant changes since the last review. So then in terms of the government's announcement to change these rules, we certainly do welcome these changes like many others. We think this is a really positive step forward. It brings the law in line with advances in science and changes in modern society and individuals' reproductive choices. They're very much aligned to the suggestions that we provided in our consultation response, and I'll go through some of those key points shortly with you. But as I said, what our experience tells us as a regulator is that any new rules do need to be clear, and fertility clinics do need to be given kind of adequate time to update their procedures and to work with their patients to adhere to any new rules and regulations. And as I say, we are in a unique position where we can help the government and work through some of these challenges of introducing these new rules, and we look forward to working with the department further on this. So in terms of a bit of background, we think these changes do come very much at an important time, given the changing landscape of patients seeking to freeze their gametes and embryos, particularly with regards to egg freezing. You may know that we hold a register of treatment data from 1991, and we hold one of the largest data sets in the world, which can tell us some key things, which I think is important for us to think about. So that is that the majority of patients who do store are storing embryos and they're using them for subsequent cycles. So often these patients do not generally need to store for very long. However, we are seeing the reasons for people and accessing fertility treatment changing over the years. We're seeing an increasing number of patients store their gametes and embryos for both non-medical and medical reasons, including a small but increasing number of women storing their eggs for later use. However, we do have little data really on the success rates of treatment following thawed eggs. The numbers are still small, and we don't have data on the outcomes following long-term egg storage. What we do know, however, is that we have good success rates for patients using frozen embryos. And we also know that success rates still are largely affected by patient age at the time of providing their eggs. So I'll show you two graphs here that I hope can illustrate that a little further. So the first graph you can see is the birth rate using frozen embryos and using fresh embryos. So you see encouragingly that the birth rate has continued to grow over the years. The fresh embryo transfer is in the blue line, and the green line is the frozen embryo transfer. And you can actually see that in around 2013, the success rate was higher for frozen embryo transfer. And I would just like to point, my colleagues have informed me, please ignore the dip in 2019. That's because our data hasn't yet been verified. That's not representative. Okay, so my next slide shows the IVF birth rate per patient age. which I thought might be useful for you to see in terms of how age does really affect the success rates. Whilst this doesn't show birth rates for eggs that have been thawed, it does give you a picture of birth rates per embryo transferred using patient eggs by age. You can see very clearly that under 35 has a much higher birth rate per embryo transfer compared to the older women providing eggs at the bottom of that chart. So going back to our consultation response then, what are the key points that I wanted to highlight to you today? Well, as you know, we support increasing the time patients can store their gametes and embryos. And whilst I said most only need to store their gametes or embryos for up to 10 years, we do believe it's important that there's a framework in place that allows patients who need to store for longer to be able to do so. And that's in particular cases where women are storing at a younger age to preserve their fertility and need to store for longer than the current 10-year limit. We also have recognise the concerns that some clinics have regarding storage capacity and the risk of losing touch with patients storing for longer periods of time. As part of our consultation response, we sought feedback from the sector and heard how some clinics had difficulty keeping in touch with patients who were storing long term. And they were often reluctant to discard samples until they'd reached their 10-year storage period, even in cases where patients had stopped paying their storage fees or they'd lost contact. Clinics also encounter problems where patients are reluctant to allow their eggs or embryos to perish, even if they're not planning to use them for their own treatment. And we think this may be due to them not being able to make that rather difficult decision to discard their samples, or for example, for religious reasons. So while we think that a 10-year renewal of consent may not completely mitigate against this, we do think this provides a useful mechanism that requires patients to reconsent and would give the clinic the opportunity to keep in touch, to discuss with the patient the reasons for continued storage, and to offer counselling. Also of interest might be that the majority of clinics impose an upper age limit for patients they are willing to treat, which could provide a useful mechanism for discussing whether continued storage for a patient's own use is a feasible option in their case. And this could also mitigate the risks of clinics treating older patients where it could pose a risk to either mother or child. So as I've said, new rules, especially around the 10-year consent process, do need to be very clear. In our consultation, we suggested there could be 3 key steps. One is that there's written consent provided before every 10-year extension, and this would serve as a mechanism to check in with patients regularly. Second, that the stored gametes or embryos are intended for use in that patient or partner's own treatment, and this would help patients who are planning to ensure that patients are planning to use the gametes or embryos in their own treatment. And thirdly, that the patient be offered counselling by their clinic before every extension. And we think that setting this condition will help patients who may be struggling to make that difficult decision to discard if they do not plan to use them. And it would provide an opportunity for them to discuss with the clinic their reasons for continued storage and implications of a possible future pregnancy for them. However, as Steve mentioned, there are some outstanding thorny issues that do need some further thought, and I've picked some out here. So in particular on how any changes to the storage rules would impact on how long donors and gamete donors can store their gametes or embryos. For example, the possibility of longer storage may have a positive effect. It may increase availability of donor gametes, but it also raises the risk that the donor may not be alive by the time a donor-conceived person were to reach the age of 18 and can access identifiable information. It could also potentially lead to large age gaps between potential donor-conceived siblings for long-term storage. It's worth noting, however, that these concerns may not play out for other types of donation, such as intergenerational donation. Here I'm talking about where a mother may wish to store her eggs for her daughter who may have a condition where she can't create her own eggs, and who may need to therefore store longer than for 10 years. There's also the issue of posthumous use. What happens if that gamete provider dies before a 10-year extension period? The issue can arise, for example, where a couple are having treatment and the sperm provider dies close to the end of that 10-year period, and it may be too difficult for that patient to have treatment straight away. Should there be an additional period where the patient can still use their partner's gametes, for example? There's also the issue of people donating gametes and embryos for use in research and their storage periods. We often hear that patients will donate to research towards the end of their statutory storage period, once they've decided they no longer wish to use them for their own treatment, at which point, however, there can be little time remaining for use in research. So again, could there be an extension available for storing longer than 10 years in those cases? And then Steve's already touched on this. What about gametes and embryos already in storage under existing regulations? What can we do there? So we're very happy to be working with Steve and the department on some of these really thorny issues. So we appreciate hearing thoughts today. And finally, so we obviously support the government's recent announcement, and it's a welcome step. But I think it's important to appreciate that fertility treatment and storing gametes and embryos is a medical procedure, and it does not come without risk. It's clear from the data that I presented you today that the age of a woman providing her eggs impacts on the chance of success. So, for example, it may not be the right option for women freezing their eggs above a certain age. Also, it's important to highlight that it's not necessarily an insurance policy to having a family. As I mentioned, there is also very little data at the moment about success rates following treatment using thawed eggs. And to patients, I think we would like to emphasise that any decision to store or preserve your eggs or embryos is a serious one, and anyone considering this must be given full information on the procedures involved, including the best time to freeze and the likelihood of successfully using them to have a baby in the future.
Our next speaker this evening is Mark Wilcox. Mark is the Group Medical Director at Care Fertility.
The talks that we've had just now have given us a lot of answers that we need to know, and I'm going to stick very much to the clinical, and therefore the effects that these proposed regulations will have on our clinical practice and where we see it going. And I think there are fewer issues with this than there are from the regulatory side of things, but inevitably there will be some overlap. So apologies if there is. Let me just see if I can work my screen. There we go. So the British Fertility Society, of which I'm one of the clinician members on the exec, our position is that we welcome these changes, and along with PET and others have been campaigning for them. I think that the scientific advances over the last few years have reassured us with regards to the safety. I take Jan's point, there is not a great deal of evidence regarding long-term storage of frozen eggs and their subsequent use, but the data that we have been very reassuring. I think that these proposed changes will protect patients' autonomy to make their own reproductive choices. I think it will reduce unintended discrimination, but we also would encourage the NHS to look at the effects of these proposed changes and recognise the need for all patients, regardless of their need for fertility preservation. So it's just remembering that side of things. The form that we have currently is the medical practitioner statement, the MPS, which all clinicians will be familiar with. And it's a short form to say, in order to extend storage, we have to ensure that there is premature infertility. And that's where we get the problem. So what is infertility? Well, there are lots of different definitions for that, but you might say that absolute infertility is the menopause, and prior to that is reduced fertility or subfertility, and therefore premature. How is that defined? Now, if we're taking it that infertility is the menopause, then premature menopause is thought to be 45 or under. So that would be the cutoff. So you can see that this isn't a defined medical definition and therefore difficult to interpret in law. Patients currently are storing gametes and embryos beyond the usual 10-year limit, as we've heard, under the 2-year COVID extension. However, many of these patients are neither premature nor infertile. And so a decision will need to be made before July 2022, as I understand it, regarding the MPS if the changes have not been implemented by that time. And we've heard that no one is going to be disadvantaged by that, which I'm reassured by. But that is certainly a question that we would wish to address. So what are the clinical benefits of the proposed changes? Well, I think most people would accept that definition of premature infertility is not a particularly tidy one, and therefore the current, what I would describe as perhaps slightly messy regulations as they've evolved over the last few years, hopefully will be tidied up to make them fairer to all and in all clinical situations. So some of those clinical situations might be considering extended storage for medical reasons other than premature infertility, and they're going to come within the remit, which we would welcome. For example, endometriosis may not produce infertility, but treatment of endometriosis may significantly reduce it, and the opportunity to store and freeze eggs or embryos prior to treatment for long-term use would be welcome. A family history, for example, of a premature menopause, premature ovarian failure, or indeed genetic testing to say that it is likely to occur. That would be a good reason, I would suggest, for early storage of eggs if requested, but for longer than the 10-year use. But under the current rules, the 10 years may come up before they wish to be used. We've already heard that there's a growing trend to freeze eggs, for good or ill, but it's there. And I think everyone would agree that if you are going to freeze eggs, then the earlier the better. And these changes will allow them to be used. So an egg provider freezing at the age of 25 currently would have to effectively discard them at 35, which may be before the time that she wishes to use them. This will allow them to be used. Now, there are some clinical issues that we need to clarify, or just to highlight, really. Currently, it's the doctor that consents to the extension, effectively, by saying that there is premature infertility. But in future, it will be the patient that's responsible. And how are we going to transition that? So there will be some stored currently under these rules, and there'll be some new ones under the future rules. That needs to be considered. But this shift of emphasis puts the duty on the patients. Whereas at the moment it's really with the medical side. But how do we stop sort of drifting or abandonment of those gametes or embryos, and what is the effect of that? With increasing storage time, the intention maybe to use for own use or for donation may change. So we've heard about intergenerational donation just earlier, and it may be that need doesn't become apparent until the daughter, for example, is older. Currently, we can't do that because of the screening requirements, but that needs a whole separate dialogue about the risk and the risk assessment of whether it is appropriate to donate those eggs. We've heard that there will be hopefully a moratorium for the current legal or illegal storage, such as those where maybe deadlines have been missed through no fault of the patient, but maybe from a lapse in the clinic administration. Without a practical legal endpoint, we have the 10-year limit removed. And therefore, that may put the emphasis on the patient to make a decision that they may not be prepared to make. And the psychological impact of having frozen gametes or embryos may be an ongoing issue, which may produce its own problems. The ongoing consent and storage fees, I think I will leave that pretty much to Jason, who's coming after me. Now, prolonged extension implies later use, almost by definition. So sperm that is stored for longer probably has fewer issues because it doesn't matter in effect how old the chap is if he's donating the sperm. There's no effect on the pregnancy, so it becomes a social or ethical problem rather than a biological one. Similarly for surrogacy or donation of eggs and embryos, but for self-use it's very different. So what we're saying here is that if we're storing for longer, we will be transferring or using the eggs or embryos at a later date for these women, and that may produce obstetric problems. Obstetric comorbidities or comorbidities of any sort, medical conditions, are more common as with age, and the effects of aging in general may produce an adverse effect on the pregnancy and adversely affect safety for the mother and the baby. Very unlikely use beyond age 55. I think currently most people would say at 50 you would have an obstetric opinion, and by 55 you wouldn't do a transfer. I know that some do happen, but I think that's not the common view. So it's very unlikely to go beyond that unless we're using surrogacy. But the medical decision is at the point of proposed use now with this, rather than at the point of storage. Donor embryos should be in line with gametes. So I just want to leave with a couple of problems as my last slide, just to say that there are some opportunities here and some questions. So equality of opportunity is one. Now, it's generally accepted currently that sperm providers have children at 60 or 70 or whenever they wish, but not egg providers, even with surrogacy. Now, that's slightly unusual. Maybe we should be considering or having a slightly change of emphasis here. It's the welfare of the child considerations that are paramount. And surely the question there is to whether there is likely to be a parent present until adulthood, till the child has reached adulthood, and therefore is gender neutral. These proposals actually will help that. Now, the other question is this statutory regulation or good clinical decision making? Currently, extended storage of gametes and embryos depends on what I would refer to as a rather questionable medical definition, as I've explained earlier, but within statutory limits. But what about, why is that the case? Surely we should be able to store gametes and embryos on a liberal basis, but the key decision is actually made at the point of proposed usage. And at that point, it depends on the social, ethical, and medical circumstances existing in those individuals at that point, and not at the point of storage.
Next up, we have Jason Kasraie. Jason is a member of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, but also Jason is the current chair of the Association of Reproductive and Clinical Scientists.
I'm going to speak a little bit more in practical terms, if this works. I've got a bit of a lag on my first screen. There we go. Speak a little bit more in practical terms about what these proposed changes might mean to fertility clinics and what they might mean in particular to the scientific teams who care for the embryos and the gametes that are going to be in storage for that period of time. But I think because I'm going to be talking a lot about the difficulties that we might have, I want to first say, first and foremost, these proposed changes will be good for patients. I very much support the proposed changes that have been made. And I think accepting there's a clinical need to store gametes and embryos longer for all patients is really the most important point here for me. So saying that, just a little bit of revision around what the current HFEA Code of Practice says. It says that centres should make efforts to stay in contact with patients who have gametes or embryos in storage, and that sounds simple enough in principle. And it also says, and Joanne touched on this, that embryos may be removed from storage if those patients don't keep their contact details up to date. Okay, so that puts the onus on centres to tell patients that if they don't stay in touch, their embryos may be discarded, or their oocytes or sperm may be discarded. In practice, that's a really difficult thing to do if you're an embryologist or a scientist. In practice, it puts a lot of pressure on you, and I think in practice, a lot of centres don't do it until the end of the statutory storage period, even if the patients aren't paying and aren't really staying in touch because they're scared of litigation. And also, occasionally, a patient will come out of the woodwork having disappeared for a few years and actually say they want to use their gametes and embryos. So we are in some difficulties with the current situation. So historical difficulties wise, embryologists around the country routinely pull their hair out when they're trying to contact patients. In my department, we contact them annually if they have stored gametes or embryos. We need to maintain current address details, ensure consents are up to date. We operate a bring forward system, so we tell patients well in advance of expiry that the embryos and gametes are going to expire and they're going to be discarded, so the patients have lots of time in which to make a decision on whether to use them or not. And we also communicate storage limits and the fate of the embryos. But repeated at the end here is we have to stay in touch with the patients. And in practical terms, that is the most difficult thing that we do. Being the storage coordinator in a centre can often be a poison chalice for an individual, because They spend most of their life chasing individual patients. And that's slightly weird because those patients have obviously very precious gametes or embryos in storage. And you would not think that they would want to lose contact with the centre that they have them in storage with. And, you know, just an anecdote here, even with an oncology patient who can store potentially for up to 55 years at the moment, you may lose touch with them for considerable periods of time. It's not unheard of to find a patient in New Zealand or Canada, and when you finally contact them, have them say, oh, gosh, you know, I've forgotten about that, but yes, I absolutely want my frozen sperm in the future. So there are huge difficulties at the moment for centres. With regard to what the new proposals say, obviously we'll be able to store the majority of gametes and embryos now for up to 55 years. On the proviso that the patients are able to confirm the materials intended for their own use, these are suggestions, and they consent to continued storage, and that we offer counselling to the patients. So there's an added layer of complexity there in terms of the new legislation if it's accepted, and potentially many, many more years of chasing patients and asking them what they want us to do. And, you know, we may need a crystal ball, I think, in some circumstances to understand and quantify. The issue we have is how many patients are actually going to want to store, because we don't know at this moment in time. I would suggest that there's likely to be quite a high uptake because, understandably, as Joanne said, it is very difficult for patients to consider removing embryos or gametes from storage, particularly if, imagine, you have one child already, but you have sibling embryos in storage. You're always going to connect those sibling embryos with the possibility of a child like the one that you already have. That said, there are some advantages to being able to keep embryos in storage for longer periods of time. You hear tragic stories of couples you know, losing children through accidents, etc. And then if they still have embryos in storage, they could try for another child afterwards, for example. So we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what the demand will be. But we do know that we're going to have to prepare for this, because I sincerely hope that the legislation sails through as quickly as possible. But centres will be receiving, we are receiving patients' queries already. You know, they're already asking what's going to happen. I think there's a need for us to contact patients and make them aware of the proposed changes. That might help, for example, in putting a little bit of gentle pressure on, as Sarah was discussing earlier. We need to develop new protocols and patient information in line with new proposals when we fully understand the detail of them as soon as possible. We'll then need to educate and cascade the team, cost up additional staffing requirements. That's going to be key. That might include negotiation with our host trust or parent organisation to obtain additional funding in advance of the change, because we have to pump pride in the system here. We probably want to inform local commissioners. I think it's doubtful that commissioners will want to pay for us to store gametes or embryos for longer. Most of them will only store for the first year at the moment, but they might want to change the information they make available to patients in their policies. We need to consider increased charges to patients, obviously, or to commissioners if they're willing to pay for it, to cover the cost of implementation. And the question, I'm glad that the question was relatively well answered by Steve. What do we do for patients in the interim? You know, and it's good to hear that we're not going to leave people to fall between the cracks whilst we're waiting for the legislation to be changed. The government, well, the Department of Health and Social Care has been very kind to us. They've published a regulatory triage assessment, which looks at the relative cost of doing these things. And I have to admit, I was quite impressed by this, because it's actually accurate. It's, you know, in line with what I would have expected. They talk about a band 9 medical member of staff, but I suspect that's actually a band 9 consultant embryologist or a laboratory director, because they're the people whose care the gametes and embryos are under. But it could be the person responsible. That person might be medical, it might be a nurse. They're suggesting, you know, around about 6 to 12 hours of that individual's time to get things rolling. And they're also suggesting very sensibly that the majority of the job here is going to be a sort of mainline career embryologist, usually employed on an 8A, and that's going to be 3 to 6 hours of their time, supported by 2 to 4 hours of administrator time. And that's when an individual or a couple come close to that 10-year expiry limit, and we need to extend beyond the 10 years. So we've got a relatively good idea, and this is useful for negotiating with host organizations for additional funding or increases to patient charges. We've got an idea for the staffing costs that might be needed. There are, of course, also other issues. So the storage space. So I'm very proud of my clinic. You know, we designed it from scratch 3 years ago. It was brand new. And we designed on the basis of capacity-wise, on the basis of the current legislation. We don't know, obviously, we can't quantify at the moment the number of patients that want to extend, but what we do know is that we haven't yet reached, in my department, equilibrium where the number of patients discarding their embryos or gametes is equal to the number of people who are actually storing. We've still got more people storing than taking out of storage. And so we've still got a growing need for capacity, and that's with the current legislation. You know, that's only going to increase. So we need to be speaking to our parent organizations now and talking about the need in the future to expand our storage space potentially. There's also additional audit burdens, etc. We do have to audit the gametes and the embryos that we have in storage. We need to make sure that they're still where they should be and they're labeled properly, etc. That's additional work that need to be done. Quite correctly, I think the triage assessment states that these costs are indirect and effectively net zero. But what that means is we are going to have to, A, quantify the costs, and B, work out a sensible way to pass them on to the patient. And because some of the costs of this will be in advance of the additional storage, patients will be charged extra earlier than the time of their expiry. And that's just good planning. You know, that's just something we have to do to make things work properly, I think. So getting close to the conclusion of my talk, I think one thing we should celebrate is that we've brought this on ourselves. It's only through advances in the sector in terms of improvements in survival rates for oocytes and embryos, improvements in technology in general, IVF success rates, as Joanne was showing off very well earlier on, improvements to pregnancy rates for oocytes. That technology is improving, but still at a very early stage. But I think also primarily the introduction of vitrification around the country in the last 10 to 15 years, that's made a huge difference to success rates and survival rates in terms of freezing oocytes and embryos. So having given ourselves a pat on the back for making this possible, I'm going to finish where I started, which is to say that accepting that this is going to be considerable work for centres, I think it's work that we should welcome, because there clearly is a clinical need to store gametes and embryos, and that's been very eloquently described by Mark and Steve and others. And the most important point is that we're here to support the patients. And I think it's our job now, once the legislation is passed, to make that smooth transition for the patients.
And now we're going to hear from Sharon Jones, who is a woman who has frozen her eggs and has been the patient face for the Extend the Limit campaign and petition, and has worked really hard on this with us.
So here's me in 2018. As Sarah just said, I froze my eggs back then. And here is me in 2020 when I started on the Extend the Limit campaign with professionals that many are in the room today, and along with Progress Educational Trust. And here is me today. I took that photo about an hour ago. And whilst we've made huge progress on having an impact in the government, listening to consultation campaigns, etc., and my hair's grown quite a bit, currently the law still hasn't changed. And so that is at the front of my mind on a regular basis as a patient, that whilst the intent of the government of extending the limit is there, it's still a concern that for women and men and people who have sperm, embryos and eggs in frozen capacity, that they could be prematurely destroyed without any medical, scientific or technology reasons for doing so. It was lovely to hear from Steve saying that they don't want to disadvantage people who have eggs in storage at the moment, and I think that's definitely landed well on a few of us, and I think a few of us have noted that comment. And it's great that so many of you who've spoken want to work with the clinics. And Jason, just hearing from you then about reaching out to your clinics in future. For myself, I don't get any contact from the clinics directly. And so that's something that I think would be very much welcomed if there was some sort of consultation and reach out to clinics. It's a good exercise to go through to update those contact details and make sure that there's that engagement, and that women and men who this is affecting are aware of the changes that are being made at the moment. So my egg freezing journey, I started to look into egg freezing when I was 27, and I did a bit of research there, and then I finally made a decision to freeze my eggs when I was 30, and then I successfully froze 16 eggs when I was 32. And so under the current 10-year rule, my eggs would expire somewhat, and they would be destroyed under the current legislation. And when I was going through this slide earlier, I thought about it and thought, wow, if I'd have frozen my eggs when I was 27, when I first started to think about this, they'd be destroyed on my 37th birthday. And it's my 37th birthday in March next year. And so that kind of really hit home for me in terms of the thinking process that I went through and the 10-year limit coming round quite quickly. And so that brings me on to talking about the decision making that I went through. And it wasn't a straightforward path to freezing my eggs. I didn't wake up and say, right, I'm going to do this, turn up a clinic, and there we go, it's all done. I had to think about the finances for that. So the finances up front, what would that cost? How would my body respond to the fertility treatment? No clinic can give a straight answer to that because, as we all know, there is no one patient journey. Would I need extra drugs, therefore more money? Would I need extra scans, therefore more money? How long would I need to store them for? What would the costs of storage increase? I think Jason's just mentioned there what that might do with changes that need to be considered in future. So once I got my head around that, I started to think about timing, the timing to be, you know, very nearby to a clinic to be scanned every other day, the timing of my menstrual cycle that's irregular and that I don't really know what's going on with it. So I can't plan to be in the country and not a friend's wedding abroad when I'm going to start egg freezing, for example. And then I came across this egg freezing 10-year rule that made absolutely no sense. So as we've heard from Joanne before in the slide that she's shown us in terms of, you know, the effectiveness of implantation of embryos, the success rates are dramatically higher for those who are of a younger age. And the medical evidence is saying if you freeze your eggs when you're younger, then you're more likely to have a success rate, a better chance of success. However, there's this arbitrary law that has no medical standing that says, well, actually, we don't take any notice of that. We say there's a 10-year limit from whatever point you make that decision, or from whatever point you manage to store your eggs, embryos, or sperm, and they'll then be destroyed from that point. So that came to my attention on my journey before I started fertility treatment, because I put it off. And I think Mark was saying before, the advice would be for people to freeze eggs, you know, between 25 and 35, and the younger the better. But I put it off because there was a 10-year arbitrary limit that I needed to consider in how soon in my lifespan they would be destroyed. But here's an excellent day. I managed to have 24 eggs collected, of which 16 were successfully frozen. And And that's me just afterwards sending a selfie to my mum to say, good news, that's where we are. And then I went home and I sat on the sofa and I thought about this 10-year limit. And then I got to thinking, how can we make change happen? And how can we change the law? So routinely, when I would be visiting different clinics or different conferences or exhibition halls about fertility treatment, most people would say to me, don't worry, by the time your 10 years comes up, I'm sure they'll have changed the law. And that's continued to be a theme that I've come across. And so I was sat there on my sofa, Googling, reading articles, getting into a bit of a rabbit hole of how I could try and make a change. And I was lucky enough to come across Baroness Ruth Deech's email, and she put me in touch with all of the wonderful volunteers at Progress Education Trust and the professionals and medics that I've been able to work alongside in the past few years on the campaign. And so my reason for being here is to give the patient a face, and that there are people out there who are imminently waiting for a decision to be made. And there will continue to be people in the future who will face the arbitrary 10-year limit. And so what I hope to do is represent them and be part of the change to help us have an impact, not just for the people who are facing storage limits today, but also for those in the future. As Jason was just saying, the embryologist and the science and the wonderful techniques of vertification means that we have, you know, fantastic methods now, and it should be that we're given those choices to have the maximum impact rather than an arbitrary limit having an impact on our futures. So after much campaigning, we've come very far, but it's not over yet. I was delighted to hear the response from the government a few weeks ago, but I'm very, very mindful that we're not still there. So I ask all of our listeners and people who are joining us today to make sure that we keep working together. And it's been wonderful to hear all of the commitments from all of our speakers so far today. And I really hope that together we can continue on that journey to get some answers for those who are currently awaiting to hear, and also make a good positive change for the future for fertility and patients.
And so finally this evening, we have Baroness Ruth Deech, and Ruth is a crossbench peer in the House of Lords, and she has been calling for the limit to be extended, and with private members' bills through questions. She's been absolutely tenacious on this over a number of years now. And following the government announcement, she called for an immediate moratorium on the destruction of eggs that reach the current limit. Ruth, a bit like me, is a woman who's not easily pleased. She wasn't going to rest on her laurels thinking it's a done deal. You know, she has vast experience in this area, and the reason why people listen, particularly in Parliament, to her is that she is a former chair of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority.
This is a reasonably happy event. A significant change is about to occur in the politics and practice of egg freezing, and it's something of great importance to women and men because the law change will affect some men and the storers of embryos as well. I'm going to start at the end with the most recent events and work backwards because most of you know pretty well the difficulties, practical and psychological and medical, that have led to a change in the law. I want to say that I'm very pleased that the Department of Health has come up with a very reasonable response to the hundreds of people who replied to the consultation, and indeed to the thousands more who didn't reply, but who have eggs in storage. Starting with the most recent events, as I mentioned, we should note that 53% of egg freezers apparently are between 35 and 40. And that's really very significant because that is the age at which the eggs are less than perfect. It's much better to freeze them in one's 20s. But what women seem to have done is waited until their mid-30s when they began to really be anxious about finding a partner and freeze their eggs then. And as we know, the eggs are not as fresh as they should be then. And the 10 years will expire in their mid-40s when perhaps they're feeling really, really desperate and anxious to use them. Now, frozen eggs today have the same success rate as fresh. So there's no reason to downplay the science. The problem with the 10 years was that it forced people to use their eggs or indeed have them destroyed far too early. Many a woman anecdotally has said, I felt that as the 10 years was coming to a close, I really had to use them with an anonymous donor, which I didn't want to do, or put pressure on some new man that I was meeting before he or I felt ready to commit to each other. It felt like too short a period. The other thing which I found was very distressing was the finance of it. Women would pay thousands of pounds to have the procedure. And then the clinic would charge them a reasonable sum for storage in the first year. And then every year that sum would go up. And if they didn't pay, there'd be a threatening letter saying, unless you pay this increased sum, your eggs will be disposed of. So the women might well spend more thousands in storage fees over those 10 years and still have a heartbreak at the end of having those eggs destroyed or further expense in taking them abroad. Now, the government, thankfully, has adopted the principles of equity for all, greater reproductive choice, reduced administrative burden on the clinics, and public acceptability. They've decided that a 10-year renewable storage period for everyone should pertain up to 55 years. There should be 10-year review periods and explicit written consent from the patient to continue storage and counselling. And that sounds to me very reasonable, every 10 years. Of course, if the patient is uncontactable or doesn't pay the storage fees, the clinic will be able to dispose of the eggs. And I well remember from 20 or 30 years ago, the first time that the storage period for embryos expired, it turned out that thousands of the owners of those embryos simply couldn't be traced because they changed their addresses or didn't respond to letters. And I think a very clear warning must be given to women who freeze their eggs at the outset, that they simply must stay in touch with their clinics, make sure the clinic has their address and that they respond. Otherwise, we'll be back to the same tragic situation. The consultation response from the government points out that there are still decisions to be made about third-party donations, family donations, posthumous use and research, and they will need further consultation, which I hope won't delay the change. The great majority of the consultees supported an extension. They were able to say, as we already knew, that the current law was wasteful, expensive, discriminatory and distressing. The few number of objectors were, as it were, the usual people who don't want any research on embryos, don't want any interference with the natural reproductive process. And although one may respect their views, they are a small minority and shouldn't be allowed to hold up the procedure. There's also been concern expressed about aged mothers. I think quite a few people wrote in and said that if women are allowed to keep their eggs for more than 10 years, you might have women trying to become mothers at the age of 70. To which I say, well, whenever a wrinkly pop star of over 70 has a baby, we all say, oh, jolly good for you, don't we? Moreover, it's unlikely to happen because under the law, a welfare test has to be applied when a woman is treated for reproductive procedures. She has to have counselling. The clinic has to consider the health of the mother and the potential baby. So I think it's highly unlikely that we'll see that particular extreme age limit. But the new law will give women more time for an unpressured choice to start a family later in life and give them a better psychological outcome, free of the pressure that I know that women of a certain age feel as the biological clock ticks away. and they haven't been able to settle down. I do hope that in future there will be a possibility of control over those storage fees. I know it's a matter of the market, but the way the storage fees go up year after year, and a very brutal demand for them to be paid, otherwise the eggs will be destroyed, is extremely distressing. I'm not sure that women realise just how much it's going to cost year after year. Now, I remain quite worried about a couple of things. First of all, what's going to happen to the eggs of women where the 10 years is expiring like now, or in the months or maybe even years before the government actually changes the law? Can you imagine being a woman who's heard with pleasure that the 10-year period is going to be extended, and yet her eggs are due to be thrown away in a month's time? I've written to the Department of Health and I've asked for an immediate moratorium on the disposal of frozen eggs until the law is changed, because I can't think of anything more needlessly wasteful and distressing than having to let eggs be disposed of in the next few months when we all know that the law is going to be changed. I am aware that the department, because of COVID, has granted everyone a 2-year extension, but it's still the case that some eggs will leave the end of their time soon, and we need to save them. I'm also a bit bothered by the statements in the government's response about needing further consultation on certain areas. That further consultation must not be allowed to hold up the immediate need to get that 10-year period extended. The other thing that worried me even more, speaking as a parliamentarian, you will have spotted the phrase in the government response that they'll change the law, in quotes, when parliamentary time allows, unquote. Now, when is that going to be? A year or more could go by. I noticed that there is a health bill going through Parliament right now, and I think it would be possible within the scope of that bill to have an amendment extending the time period for frozen eggs, because that fits in the possibilities of a health bill. And I urge the government, I ask the government most sincerely and urgently, please to do that right away so that we avoid the distressing possibility of eggs being disposed of needlessly. We've come so far with the support of Progress, the Royal College, the British Fertility Society, and everyone who's involved. We've managed to persuade the government to make this change and improve the lives of thousands of women for all time to come. Please get on with it now. That is our urgent demand. Thank you.
If you are storing gametes for up to 55 years, will individuals be screened as donors at the point of storage in case they wish to donate, as opposed to use later? For example, as mentioned, if they want to, a mother wants to let her daughter use them. So I think we'll perhaps go to Jason first on this as to why that's necessary. So if he could just explain why that would be necessary in the first place, and then we will go to Steve to see what they're thinking about doing about that.
That's a really good question. It is necessary to be screened as a donor if you're going to donate gametes or embryos. It's as simple as that. And doing it at the very outset when you have no intention to donate, though, is going to increase costs significantly for either the health service who's paying for the storage or for the individual patient who's having those gametes or embryos stored. So that's something we have to be aware of. So it has to be done before the actual donation. Yes, if you wanted to be belt and braces about it, you would do it right at the outset when you initially store.
And Steve?
Yeah, I don't think that's something that we would be providing through the legislation, but it certainly adds to the kind of checklist of issues that clinicians and or counsellors would want to discuss with individuals at the beginning of their storage journey, around whether they had an intention or a strong desire to donate the gametes that they were putting in to storage.
And Mark, I think you want to come in on this one.
Well, just to say really that I think we need to reopen this discussion a little bit, because I think that a case could be made for someone who hasn't been screened as a donor right at the outset, but does wish to do that in the future. What is the risk to the recipient? In other words, what is the risk assessment to that? If they haven't had infectious screening and so on, what is the chance that these gametes that have been frozen for many years have actually could infect the recipient, and particularly if you were doing ICSI, for example, or something like that. I mean, that may be one for Jason things, but I really think that the risk assessment, could be carried out. And although it's a requirement at the moment, does it need to remain a requirement? So, no answer, just more questions.
So maybe, yeah, more for the HFEA to do, perhaps when they're thinking about how this comes in practice. So I'm going to go to the next question, which is from Natalie Gamble, and she says, can the speakers explain more about the proposed new own use restriction? Why is it necessary, and how will it impact on intergenerational donation and surrogacy cases? So I think that's for you, Steve, first.
Well, I think it speaks to the previous question, doesn't it, that there are additional processes around donating gametes as it stands in terms of recommended best clinical practice. And Joanne mentioned, some of those issues around donor conceived people, kind of extended donor conceived siblings, if you like, and contacting the donor within their lifetime as additional issues that need some reflection. So we are covering those issues within our technical consultation. I can't remember whether Natalie's actually on the on our list to contact, but if she would like to be added to that list, I'm happy to add her.
There you go, Natalie. So just to sort of be clear, so if a couple, if a woman had frozen her eggs and then had a partner but needed to use a surrogate for whatever reason, would that still classify as own use? Oh, sorry, Joanne might want to come in on this and help you out, Steve.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, and I think that's something that we will need to explore, because I guess as intended parents, then arguably that is their own use, yeah.
Joanne?
So, yes, just when we were thinking about that as part of our consultation response, perhaps I should have said in my presentation that we did specify that we thought that own use would include those storing for use in surrogacy. And I think I mentioned that kind of one of the considerations for having some kind of checklist which says it's for the patient's own use is to prevent long-term storage where people have no intention of actually using those gametes or embryos because of the kind of difficulty in making that decision to discard, and that could be a talking point between the patient and the clinic regarding whether they do actually want to continue storage. And I think, yes, I think there definitely are issues around that kind of intergenerational family donation that need to be explored further, and perhaps would maybe be treated differently to kind of third-party donor donation. So that's something that I think Steve's thinking about and we'll be thinking about together.
Okay, so yeah, maybe the word, own, you say, but they've got no intention of using them if it's not, themselves. Perhaps that's where there's some clever wording that can be used, and I'm sure Natalie will help you with that. She's very good on these word things.
I understand she is on our list, so that's good.
Excellent. Right. So now we have a question from an anonymous attendee saying, why should there be a maximum storage period of up to 55 years? This is a question I've had a lot from journalists, I have to say. Surely that is an excessively long period. why would an adult or even a child want to be using eggs or embryos, etc., 55 years later? Why not use the embryos then for the adults, or up to 15 to 30 years for the child, i.e. when it reaches 35, which is a limit? Such a generous time extension of 55 years time frame is absurd, surely, is the question. So Steve, do you want to talk about why it's 55 years in the first instance? And then others can come on about whether they think that's too long or not.
Yes, excuse me. So I would say there's no obligation to use the full 55 years. And I would say that in practice, it's highly unlikely that anybody is likely to use the 55 years, just as though under the current 2009 regulation provisions, I would imagine there's only a very small handful of individuals. But the guiding principle around the change to the legislation was around equality, and so we recognise that there will be individuals, male and female, who may suffer from conditions that will limit their future fertility and need to have their gametes in storage from a very young age, 5 or under. And that was the principle that underpinned the 2009 regulations. And in terms of applying a principle of equality, we didn't think that it was appropriate to reduce the provisions that were already in the existing regulations for those with a medical reason for storing. So the principle of equality led us to raise the limit for all to 55, rather than meet halfway or in some way reduce the existing provision for medical storage. So that was essentially why we did that. But there isn't, as I say, there are safeguards in there in terms of the 10-year renewable process, and there are obviously safeguards in terms of HFEA's regulatory oversight, professional standards, welfare of the child, etc.
Okay, does anyone else want to come in on this one?
I may be out of date on this, but what I remember about the 55, the origin, when I was chair of the HFEA, I hope I haven't got this wrong, it was a Friday afternoon. These things always happened on a Friday afternoon. And the phone went, and it was a surgeon saying that he was treating a little boy called Oscar, who had cancer. The child was 3. And the surgeon had had the bright idea of taking a slice of the little boy's testicular tissue and freezing it, in the hope that scientific advances would allow, if Oscar was rendered infertile by his chemotherapy, radiotherapy, that in the future his testicular tissue could somehow be matured to produce sperm. So the idea came about that a child, a very young child, especially a boy, might need 55 years. And I suppose, I'm no scientist, I don't know, I suppose conceivably with a little girl, it could be that a slice of ovarian tissue is removed if some small child is facing chemotherapy or radiotherapy. And maybe in the future that could be developed into eggs. But I think there was some case about premature, as yet unmatured eggs. So it's not inconceivable that the 55 years might provide a lifeline.
I think it's always those difficult cases. There are always a small number of very difficult cases like that. That means that it's generally better to err on the generous. And I think as well, those issues around prolonging fertility by using tissue from ovaries and sperm is something actually we're going to be covering in our next event, because there's a lot of good research going on about that in Edinburgh. So I'm going to move on now to the next question, and that is, would someone undergoing gender reassignment surgery currently fall under social or medical reasons for freezing? I don't know whether perhaps Mark wants to take that as the clinician, because it might be you at the beginning that is having that conversation with the patient.
I don't know the answer to that one. Simple answer to that. I'm sure others do. I would say that it would be medical, because it becomes medical at the point of assignment, in the same way that treatment, well, not in the same way, obviously, but with oncology treatment, where you're introducing something that's irreversible, you have that opportunity there, and that becomes medical. Now, the reason for the reassignment or the oncology is irrelevant in my view on that. I would say it was medical, but others may tell me I'm wrong.
Who else would like to come in on this one? Jason?
Yeah, just to agree with Mark, really. My view would be that it would be medical. You know, I'm happy to be corrected on that, but and most people I've spoken to in the field would agree, I think.
Joanne?
Just to say that that would the 2009 storage extension regulations will come into play there, and if that person was likely to become prematurely infertile due to their gender reassignment treatment, then I would imagine it would fall under the 2009 regulations for extended storage.
Yeah. Great, thanks everyone for that one. So the next question that we have is from somebody who's anonymous again, is what should we do? Wait for the law to change or freeze now? So I think we'll perhaps go to Jason first on that one.
Well, if you freeze now, I can't imagine it will take 10 years for the law to change. So.
Well, I noticed Ruth laughed there. I hope that was just, you know, not counting your chickens. Steve, 10 years, is it going to be done by then?
That's a $64 million question. Yeah. Well, I hope not, because I'll be retiring in the next kind of 3 or 4 years, and I'd like to complete this before I retire. But no, I think our intention on a policy basis is to make the case that this needs to be dealt with as soon as possible. Clearly, there are other broader political considerations that civil servants don't have any influence over. But as I mentioned before, we have facilities through the existing secondary legislation to provide a bridge to when we change the primary legislation. So I would offer that as a kind of reassurance that, you know, we can't issue an official departmental moratorium as such, but in practical terms, we can make provision that even if it's in a piecemeal way, nobody needs to worry that their material will be disposed of after the current COVID regulations expire in summer 2022.
Ruth.
Come in. Yeah, I'm very pleased to hear that. Very pleased indeed, because in the past I had worried about a certain lack of urgency in the department. I met with several ministers over the last few years. One was completely opposed to any change, and one, Nicola Blackwood, was extremely helpful and very good on this. But the whole thing has got awfully long, drawn out, which I think is very distressing. And I would like to hear from the department that they will use the health bill that's going through Parliament now, which definitely would provide a peg. And I also remind you that the lawyer, the most expert lawyer on this, Emily Jackson, thinks there's no need for primary legislation. She thinks the whole extension can be done by secondary legislation. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to say it's taken so long now. I mean, this campaign's gone on for what, 4 years or so, and it's becoming more and more women getting caught up in it. Why not use the healthcare bill that's going through right now?
So are we talking about the health and social care levy bill here, Ruth?
No.
Or a different
That's
one?
confusing. No, there are two. There is a health bill that was introduced before the whole political pronouncement about paying for social care. There's a bill called, I think it's the Health and Care Bill, which is a reorganisation of the NHS bill. But the preamble is quite wide enough to allow for other health issues to be tacked onto it as amendments.
So Steve, do you want to come back to Ruth on that?
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, well, I think in my presentation earlier, which I'm not sure whether you were able to dial in for Baroness Deech, but I kind of set some context around why this had taken so long, and I did identify that there were a wide variety of opinions on this particular issue, and lack of, as you suggest, some ministers who were implacably against it and others who supported it. We got to a point in 2019 where we actually had an alignment of ministers who wished to support it, which is where at the point at which we were able to launch the consultation. On the health and care bill, I hear your message. I will take your message back to colleagues in the bill team and share that with them. That is the most that I can say and commit to. As you'll realise, it becomes kind of to a certain extent out of individual departmental policymakers' hands, whether that's taken up or not.
And then I want to go to a question from another Ruth, from Ruth Wild, which is for Ruth Deech. What do we all need to do to support you and give this a chance of being included as an amendment in this bill? So there you go, you've got someone who wants to help there. What would you advise, Ruth?
Well, we have to carry on campaigning with the stories like the human stories like Sharon, who appeared on the panel, women whose eggs are coming up to that 10-year limit. We need more of those human stories. We need people to write to their MPs and indeed to write to the department. And when that health care bill comes to the House of Lords, I obviously will try and put down an amendment myself. I'm hopeless at drafting, but I'll have a go at putting down an amendment to keep it on the agenda. But write to your MP. If you have a story and you don't want to be anonymous, you can face up to it like Sharon, which was great. Get on the press or in the media or tweet. Keep the pressure up. And in fact, don't worry about the politics of it. I found that ministers and departments often think that when you get a reproductive issue in Parliament, all the anti-abortion people will start trying to press for restrictions on abortion. I don't know about the Commons, but it's not true of the Lords. Remarkably, the Lords, ancient and crusty though they are actually very, very open to reproductive advances. The place is packed with doctors. And I think if there is an amendment like this, you need have no fear. I'm sure it would be supported by the House of Lords if you just give us a chance.
Sharon, did you want to come in on that one at all? Have you got any plans to do any more media work? Or
I think, as Baroness Ruth said, I think patient stories in any way that they can land with people is important. I know that for some people who are imminently facing the limit, that is too difficult for them, and I've spoken to patients before who are unable to come forward. I just took a note for myself there on some of those recommendations of writing to MPs and gaining momentum, and perhaps we can put some templates together on the PET site, Sarah, and we can work together on that perhaps. But I think that everybody who's here and the entire panel and all of the work that's being done, and from Steve and his team and Joanne and everybody who's here, the change can happen with everybody here in the room, and that's why that's why I've got passionate with this, and hearing everybody's you know, commitment to that is really lovely to hear, and I'm looking forward to everybody working together to make it happen very soon, and before you retire, Steve. I'm sure that would be a lovely way to retire, and I think that, you know, we have to do it now.
He's not going to be allowed to retire before it
appropriate.
happens.
No, I can tell that. You're going to make me hang on. I don't want to hang on. So no, an appropriate send off, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So moving on from Steve's retirement to the next question, which is from Andrew Gordon. It's quite a different theme. Where do patients stand who've already lost out on these changes? And what do you anticipate will be the issues in dealing with these cases? Do we know roughly how many women have already had their eggs destroyed due to the 10-year rule? So you see some women, you know, that is going to have happened. So I don't know who wants to go first on that one, perhaps Joanne.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we have the coronavirus regulations, which have extended storage for people under certain circumstances, which I imagine helps. I don't know if we have any data on how many eggs have been destroyed because they reached their 10-year period. I don't know if Steve has anything more to add on that. I don't think we collect data on that.
No, well, I would have looked to you, Joanne, around the data. In terms of the legislation, I think if the material has been destroyed, then the future legislation is not able to kind of remedy that in a practical way. So I'm not quite sure what to suggest on that, other than the fact that the COVID regulations did offer a kind of temporary solution to those tricky cases that have previously been tricky historical cases that have been mentioned, where I think material and consents have kind of fallen down the cracks in some way, and there's not a valid continuation of legal storage, but they are able to continue to be able to be stored under the COVID regulations, and our intention would be to offer a legal solution for those in the primary legislation going forward. But in terms of material that's already been destroyed, I think there isn't anything that we can do within our future.
Adding, just from the clinic perspective, that obviously clinics are obligated to follow legislation, and there's a regulatory obligation for them to discard once the statutory storage period has been reached, unless they fall under the 2009 extended storage regulations. We have seen a small but increasing number of patients who have exported their gametes or embryos to a clinic outside of the UK in order to continue storage, because that was the only option for them under the current UK legislation.
Jason, I think you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, just to add that hopefully the numbers will be quite small, bearing in mind that egg freezing is relatively new technology. Certainly successful egg freezing and thawing is relatively new technology. If you look at the data for the number of patients who are freezing eggs, you will see that 10, 11 years ago, the numbers were very low in comparison to today. So hopefully the number of those patients affected will be quite small.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to go now to the next question from an anonymous attendee. And I think this is something that exercised some of the columnists in the media. Will storage increase the number of older women, sorry, will longer storage increase the number of older women having treatment? So I think Mark, will go with you on that one first.
I think the simple answer is yes. If we're going to store for longer, then it will increase the option for them to have it. And if the option is there, then some will take up that option. But it remains, as I was saying earlier, it remains a medical decision at the time. And more importantly, a welfare of the child issue and a welfare of the woman, and we're saying it's a woman carrying. So there are undoubted increased risks with age in pregnancy and delivery, which impacts not only on the woman but also the child, and they must be taken into account before embarking on an embryo transfer. So I think the simple answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is that there are checks and balances in place, and provided we have good medical practice, then I think that is sufficient.
Ruth, in your presentation, you mentioned the wrinkly old male pop stars, the sort of Mick Jaggers and Rod Stewarts, etc. Do you have this as a serious concern that we'll see this rush in older women? I suppose it depends what people mean by older women as well, because in maternity services, once you've turned 40, you're on the scrap heap. So what are your views?
I think we are at a changing point in the history of the family. And I'm not sure whether family relationships, their change is pushing reproductive science, or whether reproductive science is pushing change in family relationships, or whether they're working hand in hand. But I think we're moving to a society where the traditional younger marriage, and perhaps he's slightly older than her, and you get through your childbearing years and you're living in stable couples, that is gradually changing. I'm not expressing a view that it's for good or ill, though, I'm old enough to be a traditionalist myself, but it's changing. And I think we have to keep our minds open to the fact that it does seem that fewer marriages are happening now, and it may be something to do with the pill and women's education, that women are finding it harder to settle down, and men are more reluctant to commit. But I think we stand in a time of change, and it may well be that they will look back in 50 years' time and say, this is when we started getting older mothers, more single women, more donated eggs, more surrogacy and so on. We're seeing that already. I'm not sure whether it's a good thing or not, but I do think those changes are coming, and that we who are involved shouldn't stand in their way. The most important thing to do is to counsel people and help them to understand the implications of, for example, becoming a much older mother. I mean, when I think how exhausted I am, the thought of having a child at 50, 60, 70 is just too ghastly. But I suppose there must be people who do feel able to do it. And of course, any of us could drop dead at any moment. I mean, you can have a child at a young age and sadly not live. So I don't want to be too judgmental about that. But I think we have to look at broader changes in society and how reproductive science is feeding into that.
I think you make a very good point there, Ruth, about being too judgmental. There are days when I think, gosh, the thought, and I sort of think back, my mother was an older mother, and I think, she had me running around her ankles and working full time, and, at my age, and how on earth did she manage? But people do, and if only I had her energy. So, Sharon, do you want to come in on that about older women? From the women that you've spoken to, is there is there a desire, I suppose, to push it into what we might think of women having babies in their 50s or 60s? Or is that, from your experience, not the plan?
I think as Baroness Ruth just set out, change is coming, and change has been happening for decades already, from the 1960s with the introduction of the pill to, you know, how we are living our lives today with women in the workplace, with choice to travel, to see the world, to move across different cities. And so I think it's less about a desire. It's more about a change that is happening to us as a society, and how men live their life, and whether they want to settle down and have a family at a young age, and, you know, put a ring on a young woman's finger in their early 20s and go down that's changed as well. And that has an impact for women. And unfortunately, biology is gender biased. And for women, there is a biological clock, and the current changes that we're experiencing in life and society are impacting women's ability to procreate. And that is something that's, you know, it's impacted me. And I certainly wouldn't have thought that I would be in my mid-30s and have not had children at this point. That's not necessarily been a choice or a desire that I want to be a mother older. It's kind of how life is. And so I think we do need to get with the programme a bit, and we do need to kind of, we take all of the positives that have come out of the decades of fantastic movements in terms of technology, and the fact that vitrification has, you know, has been enabled us to have more reproductive choices, but with an arbitrary limit on it, it just makes it difficult. I don't think that I would be someone who, you know, would want to be a mother, you know, for the first time in my 50s. And I would like to, you know, become a mother if I do decide to become a mother, you know, in the upcoming years. However, at the moment, the choice and the factors aren't all there. For women who are freezing their eggs in their 20s and their 30s, there are a lot of unknowns. And I think, like anybody, you know, we don't know what's going to happen to us. You know, you're more likely to die, but I could be hit over by a bus tomorrow at the age of 35, 36, however old I am. So yeah, I don't think it's a desire. I think it's a shift in our behaviours, and I think there's a need for us to kind of wake up to that.
Thanks for that, Sharon. I want to take one last question quickly, which is one for Jason, because I think it raises quite an important point. And that is, do you think that the option to extend for up to 55 years will make any difference to those embryologists that you mentioned who are reluctant to discard gametes or embryos that reach the end of the storage period that's been consented to, i.e. there'll be more or less storage in the absence of consent? Do you think it will have an impact on your profession, Jason?
So I don't think there'll be storage in the absence of consent, because, you know, the HFEA would take a very strong view of that. I think that along with patients who have gametes and embryos stored now, people will be concerned, and embryologists will be concerned also about those patients who might have slipped through the cracks of, you know, the old legislation and the new legislation. But Steve has reassured me somewhat that that probably won't be the case, that probably those patients will not be forced to discard their gametes or embryos if they don't want to. And I think that will give great reassurance to the reproductive science community and embryologists in particular.